Paris, 1911. The Nobel Committee had just awarded Marie Curie the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, making her the first person in history, man or woman, to win the Nobel Prize twice. It should have been the greatest moment of her life. Instead, she was reading death threats. French newspapers weren't celebrating her, they were destroying her. Front-page headlines calling her a homewrecker, a foreigner, a Jew, which she wasn't, but the accusation carried its own specific poison in that era. Letters arrived at her door. Some warned her to leave France. Some suggested she deserved what was coming. And in the middle of all of it, the Nobel medal in one hand, the hate mail in the other, Marie Curie made a quiet, deliberate decision. She would go to Stockholm to collect her prize. She would not hide. She would not apologize. She would not disappear. She was 59 years old. She was in the early stages of a physical collapse that would eventually kill her, and she was utterly alone. This is not a story about a woman who discovered radioactivity. This is a story about what discovery costs, about what the world does to people who change it, about a woman who walked into the fire, voluntarily, repeatedly, and refused to walk back out. Her name at birth was Maria Sklodowska. Not Marie, not Madame Curie, not the legend on the postage stamps. Maria, a girl born in Warsaw in 1867, the youngest of 5 children, in a city that didn't legally exist. That last detail matters more than most biographies acknowledge. Poland had been partitioned, carved up and divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and Warsaw fell under Russian imperial control. To be Polish in the 1860s and 1870s was to live in a country that had been erased from the map. Polish culture was suppressed. The Polish language was banned from schools. Polish intellectuals were watched, arrested, exiled. Maria's father was a physics and mathematics teacher who lost his job, and most of the family's savings because of his refusal to fully conform to Russian cultural demands. She grew up understanding something that would define her entire life. The world would try to erase you, and you would have to make yourself impossible to erase. She was brilliant from childhood, an almost unsettling kind of brilliant, the kind that teachers both loved and felt obscurely threatened by. She memorized entire passages. She absorbed mathematics the way other children absorbed fairy tales. She graduated from her Polish gymnasium at 15, top of her class, with a gold medal. And then she hit the wall. Warsaw's university didn't accept women. The Russian-controlled educational system had no place for female scholars. The only institution willing to educate young women in secret was something called the Flying University, a clandestine network of illegal classrooms, rotating locations, instructors who risked arrest to teach. Maria attended. She learned. She burned through the material and wanted more. But wanting more in 1880s Warsaw required money. And money for the Sklodowski family had run out. To understand Marie Curie, you have to understand what it meant to be a woman who wanted to be a scientist in the late 19th century. This is not abstract. This is not distant history that we can observe from a comfortable remove. The scientific establishment of 1880 to 1900 was not merely male-dominated. It was philosophically committed to the idea that it should be male-dominated. The exclusion wasn't incidental, it was ideological. Women were considered constitutionally unsuited for rigorous scientific thought, emotional, not rational, intuitive, not analytical, capable of assisting, perhaps, of copying notes, running equipment, organizing materials, but not of producing original scientific ideas. This wasn't fringe opinion, it was mainstream academic consensus. The École Polytechnique in Paris, one of the world's premier scientific institutions, didn't admit women until 1972. The French Academy of Sciences, where Marie Curie would eventually present some of the most important discoveries in the history of physics, voted in 1911 to reject her membership application. The vote was 28 to 30. She lost by 2 votes. No woman was admitted to the French Academy of Sciences until 1962. Over 50 years after they voted to keep her out. So, when Maria Sklodowska arrived in Paris in 1891, at 24 years old, having spent the previous 5 years working as a governess to fund her sister's medical degree, under a secret arrangement where her sister would then fund Maria's own education, she was not walking into a world that was neutral about her presence. She was walking into a world that had already decided what she was. She paid her own fees. She rented a cheap apartment in the Latin Quarter, closer to poverty than comfort, famously surviving on chocolate and radishes on days when money ran short, fainting from hunger in seminars more than once. She changed her name, slightly, to the French Marie. She enrolled at the Sorbonne, one of only a handful of women in the entire university, and she went to work. The Paris she entered was intoxicating. It was the age of the Belle Époque, that extraordinary, anxious flowering of art, science, technology, and cultural confidence that preceded the catastrophe of World War I. The Eiffel Tower had just been built. The Impressionists were redefining what painting could be. Henri Becquerel was working on uranium salts. Wilhelm Röntgen had just discovered X-rays. The air in the laboratories and lecture halls felt electric, charged with the sense that everything was about to change. Marie breathed that air and understood it in her bones. She finished her physics degree in 1893, first in her class. She completed a second degree in mathematics the following year, second in her class. And then she met Pierre Curie. Pierre Curie was 35, Marie was 26. He was already a recognized physicist, known for his work on magnetism and crystals. He was also, by all accounts, a deeply unusual man, absent-minded to the point of dysfunction, spiritually devoted to science in a way that bordered on religious, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of social performance that professional advancement usually required. When they met, introduced by a mutual acquaintance who thought they might share research interests, Pierre Curie reportedly told Marie that she was the first woman he had ever met who seemed to inhabit the same world he did. That was not a line. That was recognition. Their courtship was almost entirely intellectual. Long letters about physics, about the nature of knowledge, about the life they might build together around shared scientific purpose. Pierre proposed twice before Marie accepted. Her hesitation was real. She had always intended to return to Poland, to contribute something to the country that had been erased. France was meant to be temporary. Paris was meant to be a means to an end. But she stayed. She married Pierre in 1895. No church ceremony. They were both free thinkers. No wedding dress. She wore a dark blue suit practical enough to work in. The wedding gift she asked for was a new bicycle, so they could take long research rides together in the countryside. This is the version of Marie Curie that history loves, and it is true. But even here, if you look carefully, you can see something that the hagiographies prefer to smooth over. Marie didn't just love Pierre Curie, she needed the institutional cover he provided. As a married woman in France, she could not hold a bank account in her own name. She could not sign many legal documents without her husband's countersignature. To be Pierre Curie's wife was to gain access to laboratory space, to collegial respect, to a social legitimacy that a single Polish woman with no French connections could never have claimed alone. This doesn't diminish their genuine partnership, but it does complicate the romance of it. Marie Curie understood the system she was living inside. She made strategic choices within it. That is not weakness, that is intelligence. In 1897, Marie gave birth to their first daughter, Irene. Months later, months, not years, she began the research that would define the rest of her life. She was looking for a subject for her doctoral thesis. Doctoral research for a woman at the Sorbonne in 1897 was itself already extraordinary. No woman had completed a doctoral degree in France in the physical sciences. She chose to investigate a phenomenon that Henri Becquerel had discovered and then, somewhat puzzlingly, set aside: the mysterious radiation emitted by uranium salts. No one had a theory for it. No one had characterized it. No one thought it was particularly important. Marie thought it was the most interesting question in science. She worked in a converted shed, damp walls, leaking roof. The floor was beaten dirt. In winter, it was cold enough that the equipment seized. In summer, it accumulated a damp heat that made concentration almost impossible. There was no ventilation to speak of. She handled radioactive materials with her bare hands, kept samples in her pockets, carried glowing vials home. Her notebooks, still stored in Paris today, still radioactive enough that researchers who want to view them must sign waivers and handle them with protective equipment, glow faintly from the isotopes that absorbed into the paper 120 years ago. She didn't know, or she knew and kept working anyway. We'll come back to that. What she discovered in that shed, working first alone and then with Pierre, is difficult to overstate. She established that uranium radiation was a property of the atom itself, not a chemical reaction, not a surface phenomenon, but something emanating from within the fundamental structure of matter. She coined the word radioactivity. She identified that thorium was also radioactive, and in examining a uranium ore called pitchblende, she noticed that the ore was more radioactive than pure uranium alone should account for, which meant there were undiscovered elements inside it, contributing their own radiation. That observation, that deduction, that refusal to accept the convenient explanation, that is the moment. That is where everything changed. She and Pierre worked together to isolate what they suspected. It took years. They processed tons, literal tons, of pitchblende by hand in that shed, boiling and filtering and crystallizing and separating until they extracted enough of the new substances to characterize them. In 1898, they announced the discovery of not one, but two new elements: polonium, named for the country that no longer existed on any map, and radium. In 1903, Marie Curie became the first woman to receive a doctorate in physics in France. That same year, she and Pierre, and Henri Becquerel, received the Nobel Prize in Physics. Except that almost didn't happen. The Nobel Committee had initially intended to give the prize only to Pierre and Becquerel. It was Pierre himself who discovered this and insisted, in letters to the committee, that Marie's contributions were not subsidiary but foundational. Without his insistence, her name would not have appeared on the award. She received it anyway. She stood in Stockholm, the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize. She was 36 years old. And something was already going wrong with her health. Her hands were cracked and burning. She had lost weight. She was frequently exhausted in ways that seemed disproportionate to her workload. The scientific community did not have a framework yet for what was happening to her body. The framework would come. Too late to matter. On the 19th of April, 1906, Pierre Curie crossed a rain-slick street in Paris and walked directly under the wheels of a horse-drawn wagon. He died instantly. He was 46 years old. Marie was 38. She was a widow with 2 daughters. Irene was 8, Eve was 1. She was the most celebrated female scientist in the world, a Nobel laureate, a professor, a researcher at the height of her intellectual power. And she came apart. Not publicly, not dramatically. The image she presented to the world in the days and weeks after Pierre's death was composed, dignified, controlled. She insisted on giving her next scheduled lecture. She walked into the hall, the same hall where Pierre had taught, where they had worked together, stood at the lectern, opened Pierre's lecture notes at the exact point where he had stopped, and continued from there without introduction, without ceremony, without tears. The audience was stunned. The French press called it heroic. They called it extraordinary composure. What they didn't see was what Marie Curie was writing in private. She kept a diary after Pierre's death. It was addressed to him directly, written in the second person, as letters to a dead man. She described walking into their laboratory and feeling his presence in the equipment, the materials, the organization of the space. She wrote about lying in their bed and wrapping herself in his clothes because they still held his smell. She wrote about placing her head against cold stone, the stone of his grave, and trying to feel something through the granite that might tell her he was still somehow there. This diary is not widely quoted. It is not part of the official Marie Curie narrative, which prefers the composed widow at the lectern, but it tells you something essential about her. Marie Curie did not process grief. She drove it underground and worked on top of it. Obsessive, relentless, 12-hour days in the laboratory. This was not merely scientific passion. It was a woman using the only tool she had to keep from disintegrating. The Sorbonne offered her Pierre's professorship. She accepted, becoming the first woman to hold a full professorship at the Sorbonne in its 600-year history. Her inaugural lecture was attended by hundreds of people, including journalists, politicians, artists, and members of the public who had simply come to see what this looked like. She walked in, she sat down. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she picked up exactly where Pierre's last lecture had ended. The audience gave a standing ovation before she had said a single original word. It is impossible to know exactly what Marie felt in that moment, whether the recognition was a comfort or a cruelty, whether continuing his work was an act of love or a way of refusing to acknowledge that it was now entirely her own. Both things were probably true. 4 years after Pierre's death, in 1910, Marie Curie began an affair with Paul Langevin. This fact has been handled very carefully by most biographies, either rushed past or contextualized into near invisibility. But it is worth sitting with, because it is where the story of Marie Curie reveals its most uncomfortable dimension. Langevin was one of Pierre's former students. He was brilliant, genuinely, formidably brilliant, one of the important physicists of his generation, the man who would later develop the theory of paramagnetism and contribute to early work on sonar. He was also married, with 4 children, and in a marriage he described as deeply unhappy, with evidence, presented later in legal proceedings, of genuine physical violence from his wife. He and Marie had been close colleagues for years, intellectually intimate in the way that people who share a fundamental passion for the same questions can be. Whether the romantic affair began as a gradual deepening of that intimacy or as something more sudden, more deliberate, we don't know exactly. What we know is that by 1910, they were exchanging letters of unmistakable personal intensity, meeting privately, and that both of them seemed to have believed, at least for a time, that this was real. In the summer of 1911, Langevin's wife obtained some of those letters. She gave them to the press. What followed is one of the most grotesque episodes in the history of science journalism. The French press, already suspicious of Marie's foreignness, her independence, her refusal to perform the kind of femininity that made intellectual women more palatable, turned on her with a ferocity that reads, even at this distance, as something personal. She was called a foreign seductress, a destroyer of French families, a temptress who had used her proximity to Pierre Curie's memory as cover for predatory behavior. The anti-Semitic press, and there was a strong anti-Semitic press in France in 1911, the Dreyfus affair was barely a decade in the past, assumed without evidence that she was Jewish, and layered additional accusations onto the sexual scandal, that she was part of a broader conspiracy, that her scientific reputation had been built on deception, that Polish women were constitutionally immoral. She began receiving death threats. She found demonstrators outside her door. And in the middle of all this, in the literal middle, while the newspapers were running her private letters next to headlines about national shame, the telegram arrived from Stockholm. The Nobel Committee was awarding her the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the 2nd time. A member of the Nobel Committee wrote to her privately, suggesting, gently, diplomatically, but unmistakably, that perhaps, given the circumstances, she might prefer to wait before coming to collect the prize, to let things settle, to avoid giving the scandal additional fuel. Marie Curie's response was precise and final. She wrote back that the Nobel Prize had been awarded for scientific work, and that her scientific work had nothing to do with her private life. She would come to Stockholm. She would collect the prize. She would deliver the Nobel lecture. And she did. She was almost certainly suffering from serious radiation-induced illness by this point. The exhaustion, the pain in her joints, the failing eyesight, the episodes of profound fatigue. She was also, by the accounts of people around her during this period, severely depressed. In the clinical sense, not the colloquial one. She spent several months in 1912 in a clinic in England, under a pseudonym, barely functional. She came back. She always came back. But she was never exactly the same. Here is what most stories about Marie Curie choose not to examine carefully. She knew. By approximately 1910, perhaps earlier, there was sufficient emerging evidence in the scientific community that prolonged exposure to radioactive materials was dangerous. The workers who processed radium in industrial settings were getting sick. Researchers who worked extensively with X-ray equipment were developing burns, losing fingers, experiencing catastrophic deterioration of their tissue. The connection was not yet formally established, not yet the subject of consensus, but the data was there for anyone who was looking. Marie Curie was looking at this data. She was one of the people producing it. She refused, until very late in her life, to wear protective equipment. She refused to acknowledge, in professional contexts, that her work might be damaging her health. She continued to handle radioactive materials with bare hands. She continued to carry samples in her pockets. She kept radium in a glass vial on her bedside table because she found the gentle blue glow it cast in the dark to be beautiful. There are several ways to interpret this. One interpretation is straightforward denial, the psychological mechanism by which we refuse to process evidence that threatens our sense of identity. If radioactivity was dangerous, then her life's work was also a slow suicide. That thought may have been genuinely unendurable. Another interpretation is more complicated, that she considered the risk acceptable, that she had calculated, consciously or not, that what she was learning about the nature of matter was worth what it was costing her body, that the work was more important than the worker. A third interpretation, the darkest one, and the one that the diary entries from after Pierre's death make at least credible, is that she was not particularly invested in her own survival. That the woman who had pressed her head against her husband's gravestone was not, at the deepest level, someone who considered the continuation of her own life to be the highest priority. None of these interpretations are flattering. All of them are human. What we know is the documented result. By the early 1930s, Marie Curie's health was failing catastrophically. She was suffering from aplastic anemia, a condition in which bone marrow stops producing enough blood cells, almost certainly caused by decades of radiation exposure. She had cataracts in both eyes severe enough that she needed to have numbers written on her laboratory equipment in large black ink to distinguish them. She was in chronic pain. She continued to work. There is also the matter of her relationship to recognition, and specifically to the recognition she was denied. When Marie Curie presented her doctoral thesis in 1903, the thesis that contained the foundational research on radioactivity, her examining committee called it the greatest scientific contribution ever made in a doctoral thesis. The praise was genuine, the admiration real, and then the scientific community proceeded to forget that she had produced it. This is documented with an uncomfortable precision in the history of how her discoveries were cited, attributed, and built upon in the subsequent decades. When male scientists developed the theoretical framework for radioactivity, for why it worked, what it meant about the structure of the atom, Marie Curie's experimental work was foundational to their conclusions. It was also, with remarkable consistency, cited less than the contributions of men who had worked alongside her or who had used her data. The French Academy of Sciences, the institution that voted 30 to 28 to keep her out in 1911, never reversed that decision in her lifetime. She was the most famous scientist in France, possibly in the world. She was a double Nobel laureate. She had literally helped build the Institut du Radium, which was one of France's primary scientific assets. And she was not a member of the Academy. What is striking about this, what the hagiographic versions of her story tend to minimize, is what it cost her. There is a tendency to present Marie Curie as someone who transcended the sexism and nationalism directed at her, as someone whose work was so large that the pettiness simply bounced off. The image of the composed widow at the lectern, the determined figure collecting her Nobel Prize in the face of scandal, this is the image history prefers. But the private documents tell a different story. The letters to colleagues in her final years reveal a woman who was exhausted, not just physically, but in a deeper sense, worn down by the accumulated weight of having to justify her presence in every room she ever entered, who felt, genuinely, that the country she had given her professional life to had never fully claimed her as its own. She was French by choice, by marriage, by decades of labor, by Nobel Prizes, by the Institut du Radium that bore her name. And she was also, always, the Polish woman who had arrived on a train in 1891 with almost nothing, and had never quite been forgiven for what she became. There is one more thing. The affair with Langevin, which scandalized France, which generated the death threats, which prompted a Nobel Committee member to suggest she stay home, was not the aberration that it is usually presented as. It was evidence of something that was true about Marie Curie from the beginning, and that her public image has always been designed to conceal. She was not a saint. She was not a symbol. She was a person who felt desire, loneliness, grief, anger, ambition, passion, and the specific, corroding frustration of being treated as less than fully human by institutions that needed what she produced. The affair with Langevin may have been unwise. It certainly caused damage, but it was also the act of a woman who, at 43, 4 years after her husband's death, chose to pursue something that felt alive, in a life that had become, in certain ways, a sustained act of penance. That detail matters, because it complicates the image. And the image, however understandable its origins, has done Marie Curie a quiet disservice. She was more than the symbol. She was more interesting than the symbol. And she deserved to be known as herself. The last decade of Marie Curie's life is, in many ways, its most remarkable and its most painful to observe. She continued working through symptoms that would have put most people into permanent rest. She directed the Institut du Radium through the 1920s with a precision and authority that earned her the respect, sometimes the fear, of everyone who worked there. She trained researchers, she set standards, she traveled to the United States twice, where she was received with a celebrity almost incomprehensible by the standards of scientific achievement, where crowds gathered in the streets, where the president received her, where donations poured in to fund her research. She hated the celebrity. Not in the performed way of famous people who claim not to enjoy fame while clearly thriving in it, but genuinely, viscerally. She found the attention disorienting, the adulation in inverse proportion to useful. She had always wanted to be understood, not worshipped. There is a difference, and it matters. In 1921, on her first American tour, she was too ill to stand for long stretches. She moved through public appearances with her arm in a sling. The radium burns on her hands had progressed to the point where they could no longer be hidden. She smiled for photographs. She gave the correct answers to the correct questions. She did not tell anyone how much pain she was in. American newspapers described her as fragile, ethereal, almost otherworldly, which is what a certain kind of male journalist, confronting a brilliant woman whose physical deterioration he couldn't fully explain, reaches for when he wants to seem sympathetic. She was not ethereal. She was suffering, and she was too proud, or too afraid of what acknowledgement would mean, to say so. Her daughter Irene had by this point become a physicist herself, an extraordinary one, who would eventually win her own Nobel Prize, as would her husband Frédéric Joliot-Curie. The mother-daughter relationship between Marie and Irene is one of the most complex and underexamined dimensions of this story. By all accounts, Marie was a difficult mother, demanding, frequently absent, prone to measuring Irene against standards that were essentially her own standards, imposed on a child who had her own particular form of brilliance. Irene was not a copy of Marie. She was quieter, more reserved, less politically acute, less interested in the performance of intellectual authority. Marie, whose identity had been built on precisely that performance, had trouble understanding her. The younger daughter, Eve, was not a scientist at all. She became a writer and pianist, later a journalist and humanitarian. Marie loved her. She also, in private letters, expressed a kind of bewilderment at Eve's choices that reads as something close to disappointment. As if a daughter who did not become a scientist was a daughter who had not understood the lesson. The lesson. As if a life of obsessive sacrifice was something to be transmitted, like a formula. In her final years, Marie Curie's eyesight was failing so severely that she could barely read. She had cataracts removed, several times, but the procedures provided only temporary relief. The radiation damage was ongoing, affecting the lenses of her eyes from the inside. She worked by touch and by memory and by the accumulated instinct of 40 years in the laboratory. She continued to refuse to wear protective gloves with any consistency. She continued to deny, in professional settings, that her health problems were connected to her work. At the Institut du Radium in the early 1930s, workers were beginning to develop serious illnesses with a suspicious consistency. The awareness that was slowly building in the medical and scientific community about radiation sickness that would eventually become, after the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an explicit and well-understood danger, was beginning to touch even the inner circle of the institution Marie had built. Marie's response was complex. She did begin to implement some safety measures. She did acknowledge in private that the exposure levels needed to be managed more carefully. But she never publicly said what the evidence strongly suggested, that she herself was dying from the things she had discovered. Perhaps she couldn't. Perhaps to say that out loud would have been to destroy the foundation of everything she had built, to give ammunition to every voice that had ever said women shouldn't be in the laboratory, that the pursuit of dangerous knowledge was men's work, that Marie Curie's success had always come at an unacceptable price. She was protecting the work. She was protecting the women who would come after her. She was protecting herself from the unbearable truth of what her life had actually cost. On the 4th of July, 1934, Marie Curie died in a sanatorium in Haute-Savoie in the French Alps. The cause of death was recorded as aplastic anemia. Her blood could no longer carry oxygen. Her bone marrow had been systematically destroyed by radiation. She was 66 years old. Her personal notebooks, the ones from her most intensive laboratory work, remain, to this day, too radioactive to handle without protective equipment. They will remain radioactive for another 1,500 years. The woman is gone, the evidence of her work, literally written into the matter of her notebooks, absorbed into the leather of her chair, embedded in the walls of the converted shed where she first isolated radium, will outlast every biography, every statue, every currency note that bears her face. She burned, and the burning never stopped. After Marie Curie died, France gave her a state funeral. She was buried next to Pierre in Sceaux, in the grave she had pressed her head against on those sleepless nights after his death. In 1995, 61 years later, their remains were moved to the Pantheon, the great mausoleum in Paris where France buries its heroes of the Republic. Marie Curie became the first woman in history to be admitted to the Pantheon on her own merits, not as someone's wife, not as someone's mother, on her own merits. The French Academy of Sciences, the institution that voted to exclude her in 1911, still had not admitted a female member when her remains made that final journey up the hill. The image we have inherited of Marie Curie is carefully constructed by France, by the scientific community, by the long tradition of presenting her as proof that the system works, that talent will always find its way through, that dedication is rewarded, that sexism is a problem of the past. Because here, look, here is this woman who succeeded. That image is also a diminishment. It removes the struggle. It removes the private grief. It removes the affair, the death threats, the academy vote, the patent refusals, the stolen attribution, the physical suffering, the loneliness that the diary pages make unmistakable. It turns a complex human being into a lesson. And lessons, by their nature, have clean edges and clear morals. Marie Curie's actual story has neither. What her story actually reveals is something more uncomfortable than inspiration. It reveals the price that systems of exclusion extract from people who succeed despite them. Marie Curie succeeded, spectacularly, historically, undeniably. She also paid for that success in ways that are documented, measurable, and deeply unfair. The two things are not in contradiction, they coexist. And the second half of that truth has been systematically underemphasized because it makes the institutions that benefited from her work look like what they were. The radioactivity she discovered and characterized became the foundation of nuclear physics, nuclear medicine, and the treatment of cancer. The X-ray unit she developed and deployed in World War I, she personally drove mobile radiography units to field hospitals, training operators, performing the procedures herself, saved an estimated 1 million lives by some calculations. The Institut du Radium became one of the world's premier scientific research centers. The intellectual tradition she began runs directly through her daughter Irene's Nobel Prize, through the development of nuclear fission, through the reactor that powers the city you are in right now. Her fingerprints are on the modern world in ways we don't even see anymore because they are simply part of the structure. Her daughter Eve, the one who didn't become a scientist, whom Marie never fully understood, wrote the biography of her mother that remained the standard account for decades. It is a loving book. It is also, deliberately, a protective one. Eve chose what to include. She chose the composed widow at the lectern. She chose the heroic figure in the field hospitals. She chose to minimize the affair, to smooth the grief, to present her mother as the symbol that France and the world seemed to need. It was an act of love. It was also an act of erasure. The real Marie Curie, the one the private documents reveal, the one who pressed her face to cold stone and wrote letters to a dead man, was not less admirable than the symbol. She was more admirable because she was real, because she was in pain, because she kept working anyway, not because she was heroic, but because work was the only thing she knew that could hold the grief at bay. That is not inspiration. That is something more difficult, something more honest, something more human. Marie Curie's notebooks sit in a vault in Paris. You can request to see them. You will sign a waiver acknowledging that you understand the risks. You will put on protective equipment. You will handle the notebooks carefully. The old leather covers, the handwriting inside, the measurements and calculations made by a woman who did not yet know, or would not yet say, that what she was holding was killing her. The pages still emit radiation. They will for another 1,500 years. There is a version of this story that ends with triumph, with the Nobel Prizes, the state funeral, the Pantheon, the name on the periodic table, curium, element 96. There is another version that ends with a woman dying alone in a mountain sanatorium, her blood unable to carry oxygen, her notebooks glowing on a shelf somewhere back in Paris. Both endings are real. Both happened to the same person. What do you do with a life that was simultaneously a victory and a cost, where the thing you discovered consumed you, where the world you changed never fully claimed you as its own, where you pressed your genius into the fabric of reality, and the fabric of reality pressed back? Maybe that's the question Marie Curie spent her whole life trying not to answer.